Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. The United States State Department has released its annual report on human rights practices around the world. It claims human rights are now under threat more than ever and blames the decline on atrocities by non-state actors such as IS and the global crisis in governance. What can we learn about the judgment and objectives of the United States from the report? How does China fare and respond to the criticism it receives? And what practical purpose does the report serve in the day-to-day conduct and improvement of international relations? To discuss these questions and more, I'm happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Liu Huawen, Secretary General of the Center for Human Rights Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Mr. Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar from Tsinghua University. Gentlemen, here is a very serious issue as to whether the issue of human rights is open to interpretations, or does it refer to the basic idea that each individual should have his or her rights that should never be violated, or they are absolutely non-negotiable? Rick?
Well, it's a historical issue, and it goes back to John Locke and the Enlightenment philosophers of the 17th century. John Locke wrote that every man was born independent and possessed life, health, liberty, and ability to collect things. And the U.S. revolutionaries changed that to that these rights were natural from God, and it was life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So that's the philosophical underpinning, but the definitions have been debated for 350 years, and in the past 100 years specifically, Marxism had a completely different take on individual versus collective rights.
It's perhaps not just an interpretation by Karl Marx.
No.
It's typical of the Chinese cultural context. What do you think of the philosophical underpinnings of the concept of human rights?
Yes, human rights are a very beautiful term. Actually, different cultures, we share the similar thinking, the basic thinking, the golden principles. That is the very dignity of a human being. No matter Eastern or Western culture, we cherish the value of a human being. And
is that one of the major reasons why China agreed to sign UN Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights?
Yes, and the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, United Nations, saying this, the very basis of human rights is human dignity. So today I see human rights is a kind of international concern. So human rights are the dream for countries, peoples around the world. But how to realize the dream, how to make it come to true, then we have different understanding, different approaches.
You know, Mr. Liu, I'm a little bit surprised that what you say seems to suggest clearly that there are universal principles and the same basic understanding about what human rights actually mean. However, to my knowledge, public opinions across the broad spectrum in China are seriously divided between the conservatives and the liberals with regard to how to look at the definition of human rights and whether oversight and practice of human rights should be dictated on the Western terms, because they argue, as both of you have mentioned briefly, that given the cultural diversity, we should have different interpretations about definitions of human rights, at least for those conservatives, observers of human rights in China. We must look at the issue in terms of different stages of social development. For this big group of the Chinese, they argue, on the current stage of economic social development, subsistence should come across as the first and foremost, most important principle in safeguarding human rights. What do you think of the Chinese concerns, which may not be typical of all of the population here?
Well, I agree that almost every issue can be defined through a cultural lens. And in this one, I think universally people would say that the right not to starve would be a universal right. I think there are certain things that we can agree on, whether it's Eastern or Western, whether it is Marxist or not Marxist. But I mean, then there is wide open debate, and I think you pointed it out in China. I mean, there's a wide range of opinions right now on how to define human rights, and I think it's a good debate to have.
What do you think of the perception gap between liberals and conservatives, particularly in China, regarding how to define human rights?
I see human rights actually is not just a term, it's a whole system. So as a system as a whole, we see there are different principles, different norms. So we have the same thing. I see the values, the purposes, but under the values, or based upon the values, we could have more detailed principles and norms, and then it depends. So for China, our tradition, we have many good things for human rights even today, but also we have old-fashioned tradition. So we need to improve our new human rights culture based upon our own conditions. So we could have a kind of our own Chinese version of human rights, but it's not totally completely different from other culture, other countries. So we share something, and we have our own features.
What Mr. Liu says seems to suggest we have our own agenda. First of all, tackling the basic issue of bread and butter comes across as the top priority on the agenda of Chinese leadership. Is that justifiable? Instead of using ballot box to highlight the importance of free and fair democratic elections?
Well, justifiable means it can be justified, but that doesn't mean that someone in the United States or someone in Europe would agree with that. I mean, they would say, why not both? And
perhaps one of the major principles for a democracy is that we agree to disagree.
Right.
But Chinese people, particularly the Chinese government, are seriously concerned about their own image. I mean, with the rise of living standards as well as the economic status of China, the global influence in particular, China, of course, cares a lot about, and more about its own image. And therefore, let's look at some of the specific issues concerning our development over the past 3 and 4 decades since the opening up. Family planning often comes under fire from the West for draconian use of contraceptives, and you know what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yes, what you said typically tell the truth. I see different countries at different time we have different we face different challenges, difficulties. Actually, for the past decades, we contribute a lot to the international population control or management.
But birth control, you mean?
Yes, but meanwhile we are under a lot of pressure. But today we answer the new social conditions. We change the policy. So that tells a different time.
But I'm afraid that we come under pressure from within, not from without, with regard to relaxing the one-child policy. For example, we are quickly exhausting the dividends of a one-child policy. I mean, we are getting old before we get rich. This is fast becoming a concern shared by most of the Chinese. If you look at the labor-intensive manufacturing, or the so-called world factory in China, we are restructuring the economy, so to speak. This annual country human rights report not only covers China. First and foremost, I'm aware of the emphasis of this report on decline in global governance. What does it mean?
Well, this report is issued every year, but the idea of global governance goes to the administration's priorities. The White House releases this report through the State Department, and it reflects the foreign policy priorities of each administration. And this administration, it's non-state actors like the Islamic State, and I think they are putting an umbrella over all of the problems that countries are having around the world governing in an era of terror, meaning violations of what we would think of civil rights or human rights in the name of security. And I think that's broadly what they're talking about here. And different countries are having different challenges. Turkey in particular is one, because it's right on the doorstep of Syria. It has insurgency within it, and it has taken strong actions, including taking over the leading opposition newspaper. And so it is sort of a case study in the difficulties of governance in an era of terror.
When we look at the issue of philosophical underpinnings of the human rights concept, we inevitably refer to the asylum-seeking dilemma that all of the European countries currently face. However, what the annual human rights report from the State Department fails to mention is, perhaps it has mentioned clearly, that Turkey has accommodated or accepted more than what it could in accepting refugees, up to 2 million, instead of coercively sending them back to their home countries. Tackling the issue of asylum seeking could also solve the problem of human rights, right? If you send more refugees to the European Union, that'll wreak havoc with the human rights record. For example, if they are found jobless, how could they protect their dignity and liberty?
Yeah, I see. You are quite right that it's easy to blame, but difficult to resolve the problem. So today we see this kind of crisis. They have many reasons, but in my eyes, just now you mentioned that the human rights progress very often is motivated from inside, not from outside. So if the authority could respond to the social needs, the social trend, then they could achieve a lot. So no surprise that today we see again that the U.S. State Department criticizes so many countries, but I see it's not very much constructive. Today, it's not so much difficult to identify what are the challenges, what are the difficulties, but we should respect the efforts around the world to promote human rights. So I do not think the whole situation is declining. I think today, actually, in many places, people have achieved a lot. They should be respected.
From the Chinese perspective, particularly from the official perspective of the Chinese government, poverty alleviation should deserve credit. We are able to lift up to 600 million people out of poverty, at least, over the past 3 decades. And that's why here is the issue of a definition of human rights. Is it political participation that should be prioritized on the agenda of, protecting individual liberty?
Well, I do think something like that would fall under human rights. I mean, the right not to be starved, the right, if you live in Syria, not to be killed in a civil war, the right to have a place to live. It's all political decisions, what you include or not include. There really is not a large section on the way women are treated around the world in this report. I would predict if Hillary Clinton is elected president, there will be additional focus on the way women are treated in Saudi Arabia or in Iran or other places.
Here is a very tough issue, gentlemen. Let me cite Professor Simon Huntington from Harvard as saying that it is possible to have a social and political order without liberty. But it's absolutely impossible to have unconditional liberty without establishing the social order. You could first of all establish the political authority before talking smart about how to limit the political authority, because without the proper supervision, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Having said this, let me cite what happened in Syria, in the countries plagued by Arab Spring as an example. Young people turn out in protest against the corruption, strongman politics in Egypt. However, if they continue to do that, having street protests, then the investment environment would be seriously damaged. No one would seriously consider making an investment in that country. And if without a sustainable investment from elsewhere, these young people who enjoy protesting against strongman politics would have no jobs. This would be kind of a vicious cycle. So for developing countries, what should be prioritized? Should we first of all talk smart about political participation, street protests, street revolutions, color revolutions, or first of all, let's make sure that order is there, you find jobs, you have bread and butter. When you get rich and become middle-class members, you talk more about the use of ballot box. What do you think of this logic and reckoning?
I see. Just now I mentioned that human rights involve a system as a whole, so we should not just emphasize one type of human rights. So all human rights they could pay attention to and promote it comprehensively. And meanwhile, I want to say that human rights itself is not the single purpose, the goal for the society. In the UN, actually, we see security, development, and human rights as three basic pillars of their work. And inside a country, in my eyes, rule of law, development, and human rights, they are triangle, three basic goals. So we cannot see human rights, all of our purposes is to promote human rights. Meanwhile, we need to promote human rights through development of the economy, society, and try to improve rule of law in the country. Then this way, balancedly, we could really effectively promote human rights.
Thank you very much. In most of the civilized society, few people would question seriously the integrity and decency of protecting and exercising oversight of human rights. However, cultural diversity does mean many differences that need to be taken a second look at. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. This is, of course, a very serious and heavy issue about human rights. Gentlemen, in the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks that happened in 2001, it seems the Bush administration has established many institutions, including Homeland Security Department as well as National Security Agency, or NSA, for which Edward Snowden served for a number of years. Revelations by this man shocked the whole world. Now, citing national security as an excuse to demand open and transparent data from Facebook's, Google, so on and so forth, the IT giants in the United States, would mean possible violation of human rights in terms of protection of our privacy. You know what I mean. What do you think of the debates that flare up as a result of imposing national security?
I think it's a very important debate to have. It's clear with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, but in particular the empowerment of the NSA, which had existed before, but now is the metadata collector for the U.S. government, both internal spying and international spying. You have to have this debate. And whether you say it is a basic human right or it is a civil right of human beings in the United States or globally not to be spied on is something that should be debated. And what kind of your own rights do you surrender to the state in the name of security? How much are you willing to do that? And ultimately, the state, through either a legislature in the United States or a national government, will make that decision. Americans, it seems, have been willing to give up some of their rights, some of their human rights, in exchange for a feeling of security.
Freedom or liberty must be based on our awareness about necessity. This is what Karl Marx prescribes about how to make sure that individual liberty must be protected under given conditions. Having said this, ever since the terrorist attacks against Charlie Hebdo, the satirical publication, the terrorist attacks in a theater in Paris, particularly the latest development between Ankara and Berlin over a satirist, Jean Borgman, who read a satirical song pouring scorns on President Erdogan of Turkey, that caused diplomatic spat between the two governments. We started to discuss seriously whether there should be a limit to one's liberty. I've talked to some scholars who argue liberty means actually you have to give up something instead of asking for free, absolute free speech. What do you think of our concerns?
You give us a very good example. I see human rights, actually to be exact, we should consider them as legal terms, legal norms. For legal terms, I see they have a clear definition, and very often it involves both rights and obligations, both liberty and limits, and there are many boundaries. So we cannot understand human rights simply, and we should very often we should deal with human rights issue in a balanced way. So it's not very simple, and we should be cautious. But the very basic thing is that we should consider human rights under the rule of law framework.
Basically, I believe most in the West are clearly aware of political sensitivity. Because we always talk about political taboos and what should be politically correct. For example, you cannot call African Americans niggers these days. This is just one example to illustrate their awareness about the sensitivity. However, there are always exceptions. Since perhaps the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie, a British writer who was involved in the manhunt by the spiritual leader, late spiritual leader, Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. And then we have the cartoon shows from Norway, and then, you know, the Charlie Hebdo satirical publication in France. So is it very difficult to bring people back in the West from the extremes of unconditional freedom of speech to a central area? Perhaps we Chinese should also be aware that we must also get close to the international norms. Both sides must do more to show their sense of humility, to show more respect for cultural diversity, particularly religious feelings.
Well, and this is one of those deep debates in the West. In France, even before Charlie Hebdo, you have a law that prohibits women from covering themselves, which is objectionable to many Muslims. In the United States, there has been, it's at one end of the freedom of speech continuum, but there have always been limits on what you are allowed to say and where you are allowed to say it. And it's an ongoing process. It is not an absolute. I mean, Americans believe that they have a free speech and the government shall not interfere with the right to free speech, but the government can set limits within constraints of other rights. And so you have rights versus rights. You have security versus civil liberty. And again, it's an ongoing debate. It changes because of cultural shifts, because of diversity, and it changes because of threats, internal and external. It's true in the United States, true in China, true around the world in different countries and different cultures.
Let's look at the issue of sovereignty. Along with individual liberty, rights of property, as well as the issue of sovereignty, we usher in an era of human civilization. However, since the 1968 Westphalian document, which implies the basic principles of respecting the boundaries of a nation state, we usher in an era of cyber sovereignty. And China is among the first to raise this issue about how to protect the cyber sovereignty in an age of globalization under the conditions like free movement of human resources, ideas, products, services, you know, so on and so forth in the age of globalization. Don't you think countries like China have legitimate concerns about protecting their own cyber sovereignty? This, of course, immediately caused uproar in public debates the world over.
I say
because that has a lot to do with the U.S. accusation that media expressions have been stifled by countries like China, and this is very, of course, debatable.
Yeah, it's complex. I say today the world is changing so much quickly and bring us so many new challenges. So cyberspace, how to deal with it, how to face the challenges globally is quite different. It's quite difficult. Today we do not have international mechanism to manage this, and for each country, how to balance the free use of it and how to avoid the negative things. Recently in China, we are discussing the crime online. So many persons suffered a lot. So how to curb the crimes?
But I'm afraid you have also evaded, although not aware of it, the issue of cyber espionage. To protect the national security, you also have to do whatever you can to minimize the negative impact upon national security, industrial espionage, for example, through the use of the internet. What do you think of mutual concerns?
Well, I think that there are some things, some rules of the road that everyone can agree on, that transcend culture. I think the idea of intellectual property, industrial espionage would be that, and probably an agreement on the opposite end that governments should be allowed to spy. I mean, not every human in the world would agree, but every government in the world would agree. But the problem with the internet is it's very hard to limit. I mean, unless you completely shut down the internet in a country, you can't have 100% security with whatever your policy is. And so it's up to each country to figure out what level of censorship they want, what is allowed, what they do not want, what they think is dangerous or illegal.
Here is a very controversial issue about the use of firewalls. Some of the conservatives here in China argue that firewalls should be viewed as the necessary evil upon this stage of economic and social development. Of course, when China becomes more confident with the development of a comprehensive national strength, the issue of firewalls may not be prioritized any longer for overseas observers who follow the development of human rights in China. What do you think of the Chinese concerns about the use of firewalls as a quote-unquote a necessary evil?
Yeah, actually, I'm a researcher on rights of the child. So one of my topics is the rights of the child. So very often I get the information from the parent, from school teachers. They say today it's a big issue for the children to have access to internet freely, and so sure there are some banned web pages people should avoid to access to. So there should be some limits, but just as I said, we should be cautious. We should deal with it in a balanced way.
Exactly. Your concern might be justified by an allegation that those who set up the firewalls may pay commercial price. The costs will be very expensive. With that, we come to the end of this serious discussion about human rights. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.